All right, so let's look at liberalism with the pretty pictures and fonts of Miss Susan Poger. All right, and let's see how much I can get this Chromebook to put out. All right, Chappaqua, New York. All right, so where does it come from? All right, 1812, a Spanish political party, the Liberales. Who do you suppose, and raise your hand so I can hear it, who do you suppose the Liberales were opposed to and were wanting to get out of Spain? Oh, I heard a hand. It worked. Okay, hold on. Let me go over there. Colton Paxton.
The Conservatives?
No, it's a dude. Emily Delano.
Napoleon?
Napoleon. They want his French took us out of Spain, right? And but so this word liberales then eventually becomes in English liberalism. All right. And essentially it's a union of a creation of English and French thought. You can think of it, you already know this really, hopefully some of this is review. The English concepts of liberalism that we get from people like Locke, right? And Montesquieu, well, he's French. And then the English-French Enlightenment thinkers, and then sort of the first part of the French Revolution, all right? And so in England, you got John Locke, right? Natural rights, the essential bedrock political philosophy of liberalism, okay? And then the essential economic philosophy. What's the essential economic philosophy of liberalism? It's an ism. Sadie Stevens.
Capitalism?
Fourth time is the charm, Sadie. Yes, capitalism, right? And we get capitalism from Adam Smith, right? In France, a guy that you've heard of already, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and a guy that you haven't heard of, but he's going to be pretty big in the next few, well, medium big in the next few chapters, Francois Guizot. Right? Say that on your own. Francois Guizot. Francois Guizot. Good. So, Locke, this should be a review, right? The contract theory of government, the social contract, right? And he looks at the state as something humans put together. It's a thing we build and work out based on a contract or an agreement. Right? And the best agreement he sees is similar to the one in Britain, where you have a limited government and the ruler of the country is the law in the form of the Constitution, right? And essentially, and this says it well, it's a society of free men bound together by no common purpose but sharing respect for each other's rights. So the only thing that brings us together, we can be different religions, have different hobbies, different races. We just are intent on protecting each other's freedom. Okay, that's the liberal idea. All right, and then the doctrine of natural rights. All right, what are, and I need all three, what are the three natural rights? Not the American version. Rachel.
Life, liberty, and property.
Yes. You have the right to be alive. No one can take that from you. And then that life you are entitled to is free, and it's free to do what? Get stuff. Okay. And essentially, and here's where Western civilization runs headlong into many other civilizations, particularly in the case of like indigenous peoples, whether it's Native Americans or indigenous South Americans or Maori people in Australia. Liberals link private property with freedom. And so private property must exist. If we share things communally, we're less free. One of my key freedoms is to own my stuff. And so we're going to come into these new areas where everyone says, well, this stuff belongs to everybody. And the children of the Enlightenment say, no, it doesn't. I can claim this part, so it's mine. All right. So we look at the ownership of property as a key part of this freedom. Smith should also be reviewed, right? And essentially this coalesces perfectly with Locke because, right, what does Smith say? What governs things, right? The invisible hand. And that goes with Locke's idea that essentially we all, if left to our own, we won't do like Hobbes. We won't destroy each other. We will respect each other's property and deal with each other freely. Why? Because we want to do business with people in the future. It's in our own self-interest to be nice. Right? And then within that, and this sort of a deist point of view, right? Like Voltaire and stuff. And God creates this universe. And if we follow these plans, our happiness will be maximized. Right? Now, someone who is, we talked about him super briefly in the Industrial Revolution chapter, and that's John Stuart Mill. All right. A very, very strong, maybe some people say the best English philosopher ever. And so he works on all sorts of topics. Right? He learned Greek at 3 and Latin a bit later. And then he could do logician. You might take this in college. And I encourage you to, because it helps your thinking, symbolic logic and things like that. So by 12, he was a logician. 16, he's an economist. All right. And then remember, he comes up with utilitarianism. What other figure did we talk about when we talked about utilitarianism? His body is still at City College in London. And I only bring it up because when you see it on an AP test or something, you need to know this guy, Jeremy Bentham. Okay, Jeremy Bentham. And when you go to London, you can go see his body. All right. And so essentially, he wants the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but he's a little more moderated in it than Bentham was. His most famous treatise is On Liberty. And essentially he sees this, essentially there's a, well, I don't want to use the word antagonism, but it's a good word. There is a natural conflict sometimes between the government and individual freedoms, because the government's role is to enforce what the laws are in the Constitution. Those by nature do limit some of your freedom of action. Okay, essentially, ideally, they limit your freedom of action if that means to reduce other people's freedom. Okay, so sometimes there's friction between government and free people. All right, we see that all the time these days. Right? But he ultimately lands on essentially the government, and you'll come to see this as well. It's sort of its own organism, and once the government exists, it sort of takes on a life of its own, and the government exists to protect itself. So we always have to be on guard against the government. Right? And he says a legitimate government can only be coercive in self-defense. In other words, democracy has to defend itself. Right? And we see things like, in the Capitol a couple of weeks ago, right? We had anti-democratic things happening, and democracy had to defend itself. I don't know how many of you were reminded of Journées in the French Revolution when that happened, but you're living that kind of history right now. And we're going to see when we get to 20th century Europe, a lot of democracies don't have the stomach to defend themselves, and they get taken over by totalitarians. So a government can act to defend itself if it is a government that's providing freedom. All right. And he's about equality, not communist equality, okay, but sort of a modern day center-left kind of equality, like an Obama type, okay? So he wants more open government, all right? People should be able to organize themselves into interest groups, whether that's labor unions, political interest groups, etc. He says people should be free to organize themselves and as groups petition the government for what they need or want. Right? Workers' cooperatives, unions specifically, right? And then he does get kind of socialist in that he thinks the factory should be owned by the workers and managers should be elected. He believes wealth should be taxed. Right? You see how he's sort of like the current American left, right? And why should you tax wealth? To redistribute it, right? Some people, and this is the thing of industrialization, there's so much extra stuff. Some people's pile is way bigger than other people's, and so you need to take some off their pile and put it in the other people's pile. So you need to tax wealth with the purpose of redistributing it, right? So the government will determine excess profits, okay? And again, you guys are living this, how is Elon Musk, is there anything inherently wrong with him being worth $209 billion, which that's $209,000 million? Is there an excess there that the government should take and redistribute? All right. Fundamentally, at your age, you believe yes or no already. Okay. An abolition of the wage system. This is difficult, and it's not going to happen anywhere in Western Europe. And he believes it should be relationship based, not simply I pay you, you go away. Right? It's you do a service for me, I recognize that service, and so I compensate you fairly beyond wages. And then one thing that's not going to happen until the 20th century, the emancipation of women. What does that mean? If we emancipate women, what are we going to let them do? Bryson?
Vote.
We're going to let them vote. All right. And as you see, women are going to be pretty close to the bottom of the list of people that are allowed to vote as we try to expand this liberal ideal of participatory government. All right. Good God, they're even going to let the Irish vote before the women in Britain and the Catholics. All right. So speaking of that, important legislation. I talked about this a few weeks ago. Remember, even though in the British system, a tiny minority of the people can vote, the majority still feel that the government represents them. And what we're going to see in the 19th century is gradually expanding this population of people that can vote. And it's going to come out of having essentially rival political parties. And each political party wants to enfranchise or emancipate a new class of people, hoping then that new class of people will thank that political party by voting for them forever. All right. And so we get the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. Okay, so Catholics in Britain are allowed to fully participate in politics as long as they're not women. The Reform Act of 1832, that's huge. We're going to talk about that separately later, but that substantively increases the amount of people that can participate in politics. It reduces property requirements. It redraws the map of the different boroughs for parliament. We'll talk about that one separately, not today. But it greatly expands participation in government in England. The Factory Act you've read about in 1833, right? And then the Corn Laws, all right? That's chapter 18 stuff. Know that for Monday, right? What were the Corn Laws? Who did they benefit? And then why was it politically smart to get rid of them in 1846? Close to 30 years after Peterloo. And know what Peterloo was too. Now off to France. The essential dilemma in France. How can we have freedom without blowing the lid off and things going absolutely nuts like they did in 1791 to 93, right? And also, when's the French Revolution over? Napoleon declared it over. Is it over, or have we still not realized the goals that we set out, we being French, right? And in other words, how do we have freedom and order in a nation that has lost so many lives and so much wealth by this decades-long civil war, which happens at the same time as traditional wars against the rest of Europe? Right? And so liberalism in France needs to be rethought, and it's going to take on a different character from liberalism in Britain. Okay, so remember Rousseau, right? He also has a social contract. And essentially the general will is what is the basic unit is the voting block of people, the community itself. And of course, for Rousseau, that calls for limiting the size of communities, right? He says about 5,000 people is about as big as you want your community to get. And his famous quote, "Man is born free and everywhere is in chains," right? I think I had that on the Frankenstein worksheet. All right. And he says basically that that civilization, urbanization, industrialization, all those things have reduced your essential freedom. All right. And then the general will, this is tricky. This is something the founding fathers of our country were very worried about. What Rousseau calls for is direct democracy, and what 51% of the people want is what we do. All right. And Rousseau himself says you can only really do this in small units. All right. You can't have a massive nation like Great Britain or France or the United States of America and have complete direct democracy. It's just unworkable. Right. And then collective tyranny. This is what the founding fathers were worried about, and they called it the tyranny of the majority, right? So, we could, if we were going to do things democratically, and if we as a class could vote that all the blonde people have to do all the work for all the non-blonde people, right? We're going to win the vote because there's more of us that are brunettes and dark complected than that are blonde. But is that fair, even though most of us agreed to it? No, that's the tyranny of the majority. Yes, Mitchell, thank you. Yeah, so how do we avoid that? And that's the constant struggle, right? You're going to hear debates about, especially in 12th grade when you have Mr. B, the Electoral College and the Senate versus the House of Representatives. These are all attempts to make it democratic, but not let 51% of the people terrorize 49% of the people. But Rousseau outright rejects representative democracy like what we have in the United States. He wants direct democracy in small communities. And then we get to our new player who we're going to see a lot in, 18, I think chapter 21. The next chapter you're going to read about the revolutions of 1848. And his name is Francois Guizot, which I know you've practiced saying. And essentially he needs to really clearly sketch out a path between moderate liberalism, which he wants to be, an extreme Jacobinism, right? Robespierreism. Okay, so he wants to create this, he wants to straddle this line between freedom and order, which is always difficult to do. So what does he want in France? All right. He does favor the idea of the sovereignty of the people. All right. But then he says government should rest on the consent of at least the most important sections of the community. What's the problem word there? Important. Who's most important? Okay, so this isn't going to be direct democracy. All right. This is going to be something smaller than that. And essentially, and if you remember back when we had the directory and that stuff, the franchise or the right to vote is all men of property. And then the debate is just how much property do you have to own to be able to vote? And we'll see in both Britain and France, they keep lowering that amount to include more and more men until ultimately we're going to get universal male suffrage. The working class, he does not want to be involved in democracy because he thinks that they're too, essentially there's this view that the poor are too hungry to think properly. And they're too erratic and they're too easily fooled because they're not what? Educated. Okay, so this is the bourgeois middle class liberalism that wants to keep the working class out because they don't know what's best for them. And essentially, he wants to copy Britain or the Constitution of 1791 and have a good constitutional monarchy. So he's very much, in French terms too, he's a conservative liberal. All right. And here's the essential political question. What's more important, liberty or equality? Okay. Is freedom the most important thing, or is, fair distribution of things more important? And the moderate liberal, the bourgeois liberal, the American conservative will always say that liberty is the most important. You should not take away liberty in an attempt to be fair. Okay. And then he also is very much a child of the Enlightenment, in that he says man can self-govern and self-control if that man is educated and a man of property and a man. Right? But he wants freedom of the press, all right, which is something that's going to be largely achieved throughout Europe in the 19th century and then largely taken away in the 20th century, at least up until World War II. Right? And the free right of assembly, okay, and he's gonna regret this come chapter 21. But essentially, yeah, we have the right to get together, and but then, and this, we're dealing with this in this country. Once we get a bunch of people together, what can they do? What can't they do? Okay, and then ultimately, the ultimate liberal thing we've been talking about all year: written constitutions that guarantee what? I hear a hand, and it's Bryce. Bryce, let me see if someone else wants to play. Felix.
Is it property?
Private property, my man. Good job. Yeah. Written constitutions that guarantee private property, because again, the classic liberal view is you're not really free unless you are able to own stuff. Okay. And so essentially, here's what we're going to get, right? Laissez-faire economics from Adam Smith, right? Free trade, not mercantilism. Lower tariffs, that goes with free trade, right? Anti-unionism, this is going to happen, and we're going to see this throughout the 19th century in Europe, Western Europe, and the United States, and that is, do the workers, do they have the right to organize themselves and to act collectively to improve their condition? And it's going to be fought against a lot, okay? And it's still fought against. All right. And faith in science. This is an interesting thing. Essentially, they've seen, if you look by the early 19th century, look at all the progress. We have steam engines. We have gas light in some of the major cities. We have mass-produced goods. We have all this progress and all this wealth. And now, even the poorer people have more than the richer people did 100 years before. So if you look at this, there's this faith in liberalism that we're always going to have scientific and technological progress, and that's always going to increase wealth without any forcible redistribution. Okay, so think of the computing power that we all have in our hands with our phones, right? That wasn't available to the most powerful government in the world 50 years ago, 40 years ago, okay? And so they say, look, science and wealth will be able to grow food more efficiently. The price will come down. There won't be starvation, right? Consumer goods will become more and more affordable. All of this, okay, they say that's what's going to take care of people, is things are just going to get better, all right? And that's an essential belief. And it's not a bad belief to have. You want to be optimistic, okay? But ultimately, a society is going to have to deal with the fact that things aren't getting better as much as they used to, all right? And they are hostile, not violently hostile, not like the Jacobins, but they think that organized religion and the aristocracy are a bit fuddy-duddy and anti-liberal, which they are, and so they seek to check their power, but only through politics, not through revolution. Okay, you don't have like the Great Fear where you burn their chateaus down. You outvote them in Parliament. Okay. And they think basically change happens by legislation. All right. That's, we participate in politics, and if we want things done, we'll do them through the political process, not through journées and revolts. All right. And generally, they don't like the building of empires through military conquest. And they don't like a standing army, because the government can use the standing army to rule dictatorially. Now, they're going to completely go against us by the time we get, geared up for World War I. But essentially, like the British, they don't want to have standing armies that can be used by the government. Right? And the main thing we want to do is not have revolution. We don't want the propertied classes threatened by the non-propertied classes. And then fast forwarding a little bit, here's Guizot accepting the charter from Louis Philippe. We're going to see this in 18. This is 18. Oh boy, the People's Charter. I'll have to look it up. But essentially, he's going to be essentially the French prime minister while Louis Philippe is king. And they are going to get deposed in another revolution in France. So who could disagree with liberalism? Why is it going to be challenged, right? Well, obviously, the conservatives are going to disagree with it. The unpropertied peoples are going to disagree with it, right? The factory workers, etc. Organized religion is going to disagree with it because organized religion feels it should have a favored place in society because it benefits society, right? Militarists and imperialists are going to challenge it. It's going to be challenged from all over, right? And it's also going to be challenged when it fails, right? So when liberals are in power and things go bad, people question liberalism, okay? So on the time of the potato famine in Britain and Ireland, which we'll get to, that challenges liberalism. How could there be this mass starvation and millions of deaths in a country that's run by competent people for the good of everyone? All right, and then Great Depressions will challenge liberalism. Okay, so all of these events are going to challenge liberalism throughout the 19th century, but plucky little liberalism is going to just keep on expanding its power until it's ultimately completely discredited by the First World War. And that's when the opponents of liberalism are going to either take back or take power. That's going to make things really interesting. All right, so now we've set up our major players, liberalism and conservatism, and to a lesser extent, socialism and Marxism.